Well, hello everybody. It's Jessica from Champagne Blue Sewing. I am back with another tutorial. Today we are going to sew the finishing touches for the kimono robe. If you weren't part of the holiday sewing challenge that we did a couple of weeks ago, this is the icing on the cake. This is the last couple of things that you need to know to finish your robe. I didn't include these in the original tutorial, live tutorial that I did for a couple of reasons. If you're new to sewing and if you've never sewn a robe before, it can be a little bit overwhelming, I think, in a big project. So the way to change that is to break it down into smaller bite-sized pieces that are easier to accomplish. So even if you have sewn your robe, you can go back and add these details to the robe. It's not that hard. It's just a few little things, and it'll make your robe more wearable, and you'll be happier with it in the long run as a great piece in your wardrobe that lasts a long time. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the pocket. So the pocket piece for this robe looks like this. It's pretty standard, you know, among bathrobes. There's not a lot of variation in robe pockets. This is a side seam pocket. And you'll need a total of 4 pieces of fabric to cut for the pockets. I am using some scrap fabric because in my original robe, I put the pockets in it. And then when I came back to do the tutorial, I was out of fabric. So I'm using a different fabric, but you get the idea. So for the robe, you're going to mark the notches on here. There's a notch at the bottom and towards the top of the pocket. And you'll notice that the notches are a distance from the very edge, and they're that way for a reason. We'll talk a little bit about that so it makes sense to you when you go to do your project. I am using, again, some scraps, so bear with me. You would normally be doing this in the side seam of your garment. The robe is placed a few inches down from the armhole. You can see it there. And if you notice here, it's right underneath the belt loop and the belt. Hopefully everybody can see that. I'm doing a lot of different devices here. So the belt loop for the belt is here. Pocket is just below that. So you have an idea of placement. And depending on where your waistline falls, you may have to adjust that a little bit. I am longer waisted, so I tend to put my pockets down a little bit further. And same with the belt, because otherwise it just doesn't hit me at the waistline. So once you've got your placement figured out, you're going to line up your pocket piece with your fabric. So in the side seam of your garment, there are also notches there to line your pocket up with. And you're going to put it together right sides matching. Here we go. Okay, so we're going to stitch this seam here, starting between the notches. Okay, just between the notches. I'm using a all-purpose thread for this project and 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. The needle size is about a size 11 needle because I'm just using a cotton fabric. Okay, so here's my first one. And cut your threads. There's the first part of the pocket. Okay, now we're going to do the other side. Again, we're going to sew right sides together. Same process. Line it all up. While I'm getting this together, make sure and drop me a comment here. Let me know where you're watching from. For the challenge, it was a lot of fun. We had people from all over, everywhere. We had Africa and New Zealand and Canada, all kinds of different places. So I love knowing where everybody's watching from. Okay, I'm going to stitch the same thing here, starting at the notch. I say 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. My machine isn't cutting today. Figures. Okay, so you can press this seam and then press your seam allowance toward the garment. So in other words, not toward the pocket, but toward the garment itself. So this direction, you're going to press it that way. I'm going to skip the pressing for the time being. The next step would be to put your pieces front to back. So essentially we have sewed the pocket on the front of the garment and on the back. And now we're going to put the pieces together. And I'll show you how it will sew around the shape of the pocket so that it has a nice bit of strength to it. Pockets, as you know, are a stress point. And if you've ever walked past a knob in your kitchen or a doorknob or something, your pocket can get caught on it and it rips very easily. So there's a few things we can do to ensure that it's going to hold up in your garment. So the first thing I would do is, if you were sewing the side seam of your garment, this is what you would do. You would sew down the side seam to the notch where the pocket is, not the notch in the pocket. And you're going to have a little bit of an overlap in stitching between the pocket stitching and the side seam. And don't let that confuse you. It's okay, because I said it's a stress point. So it's okay to have the stitches kind of overlap in that area. Then you're going to stop. You're not going to sew all the way down just to the notch. Again, 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And then I tack the stitches. And cut it. So that's the top portion. So it's stitched only this far. Here, the reason for that is you have to be able to stick your hand in the pocket. And now we're going to do the bottom part of the pocket. Same process, starting from where the stitching line is, the notch is rather. Okay. Don't forget to back tack. All right. So now, and that's pretty straightforward, right? You understand that part. Now we're going to go back and stitch around the curve of the pocket. So what I do is, again, start at the notch and go all the way around the side of the pocket to the other notch down towards the bottom. Again, same seam allowance, 5/8 of an inch. And I start stitching right where that stitching line is from the pocket. Line your needle up there as best you can. And I'm not a big fan of pins, so I just use my fingers as I go along. You can come back and finish your edges. As the very last step here, you can use pinking shears if you have a woven fabric, or serge them together. Okay, and I'm ending right where the notch was. Okay, so my pocket is now stitched. Needs some pressing, obviously. My machine is acting weird today. Okay, press it and then check the right side. So what you're going to have is this. Your pocket opening will be here. Put your hand in there. Make sure your hand fits. Make sure you don't get any big lumps or bumps along in here. If you give it a good press, it should be nice and flat. Let me see if I can do that quick. I didn't think to turn my iron on. So anyway, Mine's not as flat as it could be, but that's what it's going to look like. So that's your outside pocket. So before you do anything else, I recommend putting a small tag at the top of the pocket and the bottom of the pocket for reinforcement. Some sewing machines have a tack built in, a bar tack. My Husqvarna Diamond has 2 bar tacks. One of them's 1/2 inch, the other one's maybe 3/8 of an inch. And you can also use a small narrow zigzag stitch for this. You just want to put a few stitches there to keep this from ripping at any point. So after you've finished your side seams, this is what you would be doing next, putting the tack on here. So I'm going to stitch this tack. And on mine, I just have to push the start button. And the machine does all the work. So top and bottom of the pocket, put your tack in there. And you'll have extra layers of fabric because you'll be stitching over the seam allowance. So that's okay. All right. There we go. So it's tacked. It helps keep the pocket straight and flat and keeps it from flopping around on the inside of the garment. Your pocket will always stay put towards the front of the garment instead of migrating towards the back as you wear it. So simple enough. That's what there is with the pocket. Now, the next step is to sew the carrier loops. In the industry, we always refer to them as carriers. I'm not quite sure why that is. They're belt loops, carriers, whatever. They are about 1/2 inch wide. And the easiest, most efficient way to sew them is to sew them in one long strip as one process. So I'm going to show you how to do that. So I have a piece of fabric here. It is about 2 inches wide. And I'm going to sew it with right sides together. We're making a tube, essentially. I'm going to put that under here, and I'm going to sew with 1/4 inch seam allowance. Oops. Let me go back to my original stitch here. So back to my straight stitch, 3.0 stitch length. 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to sew the length of the tube. And I always make my tube a little bit longer so I have plenty of length here. You can adjust the length of your carriers more when you put them on your garment. But I like to have plenty here. I actually usually figure on 3 carrier lengths. So in this case, the carrier itself is probably 4 inches, I'm guessing. Let's see. Can't be that big. 3 inches finished between the top and the bottom. So I cut a strip about 12 inches long for this. So we've sewed our strip right sides together, just single needle with 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm using my loop turner. This is a very old loop turner. I've had it forever, and it's my favorite sewing tool. It has a little tiny hook at the end for grabbing onto the fabric with. You can also use a bodkin, probably would work also. We're going to turn this right side out. So I'm putting this through my fabric all the way to the end. I use that little hook to grab onto the end of the fabric so we can pull it right side out. I can get it to turn. It's a little bit easier to turn these if you use your fabric on the bias. And depending on what your print is, you may not want to do that. In this case, I'm just using scraps, so I just cut it on the straight, and when it's cut on the straight, it's a little bit harder to slip it through. There we go. Come on. By the way, if you haven't posted a picture in the Chambray Blues group of your holiday sewing projects, I would love to see what you're making. It's a lot of fun to see what other people are doing, and it's inspiring for everybody else. Us creatives, we need each other to be inspired. Okay, so here we go. Got it turned right side out. Again, you want to give that some pressing. You can top stitch this if you like. That again is another great way to keep the strength factor there. If you have top stitching on there, it's not going to rip as easily. All right, so I would cut this into 3 sections. And the reason I use the number 3 for this is because you want to have 2 carriers for your belt, one on either side. And then it's also nice to have a loop to put at the center back neck, at the inside of the neck, so that you can hang your robe on a hook. And that's really a useful tool. High-end garments always have these sort of little details, and I love doing that, things like that in my sewing when I get a chance. So I would recommend that. For now, we're going to stitch this on here just above the pocket, and I'm going to show you how I do it. It's not difficult. I usually just fold back the ends about 1/4 inch on each end, and you're going to place it right above this tack you did above the pocket. I use the same tack stitch for the carriers. You can use a single needle stitch as well. Okay, so we're going to place this here. Of course, you want to double check, make sure that your belt is going to fit through the carrier also. We're just going to stitch this on. I'm using a single needle stitch this time, so you can see that. Just back and forth a little bit. I sew it twice because I want that reinforcement. Okay, so that's the first part of it. This one, I'm running out of fabric here, so I'm going to make it a smaller loop. See how that works? And we're just going to tack this down at the top. Cut it a little shorter. Okay, so there's my belt loop. Simple as that. So you do that on both sides. If you have a belt loop, obviously here, and then I use the last loop for the center back neck inside the robe. Okay, so that's what the 3 are for. Now, the belt is your next task. I like my belts a little bit longer, probably because I'm a little bit thicker around the middle and I need a little extra room, but I like to be able to tie a nice bow at the front. So I usually measure the waist and then, kind of play with the fabric and decide how long I want it to be. It can be as narrow as you like, or I would say no more than 4 inches wide. That's kind of cumbersome for a sash, but I have seen robes with a little bit wider belts. Depending on your personal preference, you could make them a little bit wider. I cut my fabric for my belt 5 inches wide. Yes, 5 inches wide. So I'm going to walk you through how to make the self fabric belt. Pretty simple. We're going to start with right sides together, and we're going to sew the two pieces. So I've got two pieces, I should say. Usually it's the width of the fabric. For cotton like this, cottons only are about 45 inches wide, sometimes less, even 44 or 42, depending on what you're working with. So you may need to cut multiple pieces to get a belt the right size, especially if you're working in one of the larger sizes. So you're going to start by sewing right sides together, the short end first. Same stitch, just regular 3.0 millimeter stitch. Okay, you can press that. And then we're going to open it up like so. And now we're going to fold it lengthwise. And start sewing at the other end. Does that make sense? So this seam is going to be basically at center back waist, and then you'll have the rest of the belt to go around you. It's easier to think of it that way if you always think of this as centered back. So we're going to start at the opposite end, and again we have right sides together. I'm making my belt just straight across. You can get fancy and do an angle at the end if you prefer, but for simplicity's sake, we're going to keep it straight for now. So we're going to stitch this together. Again, 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And I'm going to stitch close to the edge here. When I get to the edge, I'm going to back up, raise my presser foot. I'm going to take one stitch at an angle, 45-degree angle in that corner. So I'm going to raise my presser foot up again and then continue down the other side. And the reason we do that so that it's easier to turn, you get a nice square corner. I'm going to stitch the length of the belt. And we need to leave an opening to turn the belt. So I usually gauge about 8 inches total. So I'm just going to put a pin in here so I know when to stop. So I stop stitching there, and then we'll start again to stitch the other part of the belt. Okay, I'm up to my pin mark. And back tack a little bit there. Okay, now we can do the same stitching on the other side. Make my opening even. I'm really bad about just kind of eyeballing things. That's just how I roll. You can measure if you prefer. So I'm starting my stitching here. So I have this opening to turn the belt to the right side. Again, it's 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Nothing tricky here. And then slow down when you get to the other corner. Same process. I'm gonna put the needle down in the fabric, raise my presser foot, take one stitch that's diagonal, and then raise the presser foot again, and make a straight stitch to the end of the piece. Back tack at the end. Okay, so you're going to press this a little bit before going on, and then you can trim the excess fabric. I usually trim down to 1/4 of an inch, just at the very end of the belt. And you're going to make a sideways cut, an angled cut at the corner here. You want to cut away all this extra fabric so that when you turn it to the right side, you don't have any bulk at the very point. You do that on both ends. Other side. There we go. Okay. Now we can turn it right side out. And there's not really a trick to this. I usually use a pencil for turning things right side out. If I can find my pencil. Here it is. And I love to use the pencil with an eraser on it because that way it doesn't cause problems, doesn't get caught in the stitches and rip stitches as you're trying to turn it. So I just use the eraser end of the pencil and push it through. Once you get it started, it's really easy to do. You can use a ruler too, like a wooden ruler works really well, or a yardstick. For a longer belt, a yardstick would be very handy. It's got to be something kind of stiff. You know, plastic ruler doesn't usually work so well. Okay, so I'm pulling this end out through the opening that we left. Ta-da! And to get the point perfect on here, you're going to take a straight pin, and with the tip of the pin, reach in here and pull out both the corners, just gently, and look at that. Nice, straight, square corner for this belt. Okay, so that's the one end. We'll do the other end the same way, so you can watch it again. Using just a regular pencil with an eraser. And I'm pulling the fabric apart with my fingers to kind of get it started. And then I put the pencil in there and push it through. I had to go to fashion design school to learn this, you guys. You learned it for free today, so you're lucky. Kind of funny, I saw an ad come out for I think it's the Sewing and Quilt Expo is doing an online event this year because of the COVID thing. And they're doing a kimono class. Made me think that you guys got it all for free. Like, you could sign up and take a kimono class if you wanted to, but you got it free here on my page, on my channel. So you wouldn't have to do that. Okay, so here we go. Here's the tip. Take the pencil out and just pull it through. Ta-da. Super easy. And then we'll use our straight pin again. Pull out the corners like so. It's amazing what that one stitch does in the very tip of this belt. That one stitch at an angle would give you this beautiful straight corner that you just can't really get if you turn the stitching and just start sewing. An angled stitch does make such a huge difference there. Okay, so now the only thing we have left on here is to close our opening. And you can hand sew this closed if you like, but I am not really a fan of hand sewing because I'm lazy, number one. But number two, I don't think it's as durable as sewing with a machine. So I always use my machine for things. So we're going to top stitch this closed. You can press it, give it a good pressing, and press those edges, raw edges inside so that it's even with everything else. I'm just going to use my fingers here and finger press it. And we're going to just put it underneath our needle and start stitching about 1/2 inch before the opening. I'm using the same stitch length as before. I'm going to keep only an 1/8 inch distance between my needle and the edge of the fold of the fabric. Make sure you line up your seams at the center back. Go all the way over the seam to the other side. You can also top stitch this way all the way around the belt if you prefer, so your stitches are completely hidden. I don't usually do that, but that again is another way to make your belt really durable. There we go. It's all finished. So it needs a little pressing, but the belt is then ready to go. Okay, last detail on the robe, and it's something that you don't really see, but it makes a huge difference in the function of the garment. On high-end robes, there will be a piece of spaghetti. I call it spaghetti. I guess it may have another term. Bias, like a tube of bias fabric. You could say inside the robe, right above where the carrier is on the outside. So it's attached usually to the seam allowance, not to the outside of the robe, but to the seam allowance. And one piece of it will be here at the side, and then another piece will be at the edge of the garment. The whole point is so that you can tie this together and keep your robe from slipping open. So on this robe, like I said, I ran out of fabric, so I didn't do it, but I'm going to show you how we can do that. It's very similar to what you did to make the carriers with. And I made a sample earlier so you could see. I used the same 2-inch wide piece of fabric. It's probably 12 inches long, a little longer, 15 inches. Length isn't really a huge issue, but it has to be long enough so that you can tie it together. So it's just the tube, and then we turn it right side out. And I put a knot in one end to keep it from fraying. You can use a little fray check if you want to. You can sew across this to also, top stitch it shut. There's a number of different ways you can do that. But I'll just show you how that works. And then you can see how we put it into the robe. It says 2 inches wide piece of fabric. I usually cut this piece the same length that I do for the carriers, and the same width. It's just kind of nice to be consistent all the way across the board. So here I'm using a little bit wider seam allowance, maybe 3/8 of an inch. You don't want it too thick so that it shows when you're wearing the robe. You don't want it bulky. Okay, so we sewed that all the way to the end. Once again, we're using our fancy dancy loop turner to turn it. My favorite sewing tool. And while I'm working on this, so I have a question for you. I was thinking about doing another free sewing challenge coming up in December here. And if you have any suggestions or something that you would like to see um, for a holiday gift, leave me a comment. Let me know. Because I'm working on putting another free challenge together. Okay, so here we have this. We're turning it right side out. You can press it. You can top stitch it if you like. I don't usually. It's on the inside. No one really sees it, so I don't generally take the time to do that, but you can if you wish. Okay, to make the knot at the end, so you're just going to wrap it around your finger, like so, and then take the tail and pull it up from the top, just to make a single knot. And I work it towards the end with my fingers. And then I just cut this end off, any loose threads at the end. You can heat set it with a little bit of flame if you like. I usually use a little bit of freight check on there. If I can find my freight check. I don't know where that went. But anyway, freight check is a great product. It's a little liquid. It's clear. It doesn't cost much, and it keeps things from unraveling. That's an easy thing to do. So on this robe then, what you would do is you find your placement. So like I said, you don't want to put it on top of the belt loop. You want to make sure your belt loop remains open. So you're going to use the seam allowance just above the pocket, and you're going to stitch it inside. I'm just going to pin this for you. For the moment, you want to line it up on both sides. So make sure that the two of them are aligned and that you don't have one that's real higher than the other. I'm just folding under the raw edges just to pin it like so. And then we'll just top stitch that a little on here so you can see what it's going to look like when it's finished. And it's okay to use contrasting fabric. It's kind of fun. Nothing wrong with that. I'm just folding my raw edges underneath. And just stitch across it a couple times because, again, this is a stress point. Okay, there's one. You can clip your threads a bit. And now we'll do the other side. So for this inside one, it's really important that you just catch the seam allowance, not the belt or the loops on the outside. Got some extra threads here. Alrighty. And that's all there is to it. So when you put it on, you're going to use these to tie your robe like so. Keep it from opening up while you're wearing it. And then you have your belt. And your carriers. And that's all there is to it. So another suggestion I would make for you if you're making a gift for someone is to put a label at the center back neck. I have some labels I had ordered with my logo on them from, I think it's Label Weavers is the company. I can put that down in the chat here. not affiliated with them in any way. I just really like their product. They weren't real expensive. You can have labels say designed by so-and-so or made with love, or whatever you want. But it's just kind of a nice finishing touch to put a label at the center back neck when you put in that little loop at the center back neck for hanging your robe. So that's it. That is the end of the kimono robe project. You can make a shorter version of this robe as well. This robe back here, you can't all see it, but I have another one on my Instagram page and on my Facebook page. It's in this same red fabric, and it's the same pattern. I just cut it shorter and didn't do any of the fancy things, just a short basic robe, no pockets or anything in it. And I love it. I wear it with jeans and a tank top underneath. And it's now one of my favorites. So I'm going to make a couple more of those, maybe even for holiday gifts for people. So let me know what you think of this tutorial. If you have any questions, please leave a comment. I'd be happy to respond to them. You can also DM me directly, and I can answer questions that way. Not everybody feels comfortable asking for help. So let me know what I can do to help you. And again, if you have any ideas of something you'd like to see me sew for the next sewing challenge, please let me know. I am considering a pants challenge. I've had a lot of requests from people wanting to learn how to sew pants. So that might be something that we do again, another pant project. But we'll see what we end up with. One more thing, I have some openings for personal sewing consultations. I just started doing that maybe a month ago, and it's been good. I've had a number of people sign up for it. So if you are working on something and you're stuck and you don't know what to do next, I'd be happy to chat with you. Again, you can send me a DM if you're interested in that, and I can let you know what my availability is. So that's all for today. You guys have a great day. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.